Recently, Nintendo added another game to their Nintendo Switch Online service called Spanky's Quest. And generally speaking, everyone on the internet had the same reactions. What's Spanky's Quest? Or Spank the Monkey. Hilarious. But me, I instantly knew Spanky's Quest. Spanky's Quest is a platformer starring a monkey named Spanky who fights sentient fruits and vegetables, and I know the Game Boy version extremely well. To me, it's a classic, but I'll be honest, I don't know the Super Nintendo version that's now on the Switch really that well. Okay, so Spanky's Quest Game Boy and Spanky's Quest Super Nintendo have the same cover, the same name, the same basic control mechanics, but completely different levels. And in North America, they were released simultaneously in July 1992. But in Japan, the Game Boy version came out 9 months earlier than the Super Nintendo game. So it's honestly better to think of the Super Nintendo game as a sequel to the Game Boy game because the Super Nintendo game has a few more mechanics, much more elaborate levels, but we'll get there. But first, let's take a step back. During my summers at daycare, me and my friends brought our Game Boys to the daycare and our collections every day, and we played each other's games. We probably had about 5 games each, but miraculously not much overlap. So I had Super Mario Land 2, a friend had Super Mario Land 1, and we'd borrow throughout the day, and in this way I played a lot of the Game Boy's highlights. I also played a lot of its lowlights. The bad Simpsons games, the bad sports games, the bad Tetris wannabes. And then there was this weird middle area of games, games not as good as the all-time classics, but, still pretty enjoyable. And that's where Spanky's Quest for the Game Boy fell. Because Spanky's Quest is, it's a pretty simple game to grok. It's a single-screen puzzle platformer where your goal is to kill all the enemies on screen. There's a lot of different enemy types and architecture for the time, so the levels all end up being pretty unique. And Spanky's Quest is one of those games built around one game mechanic and then focuses on exploring that to the fullest. And in this case, it's bouncing a ball on a monkey's head. At this time, we didn't have instruction manuals, so figuring these games out was trial and error. At first, I noticed Spanky shot a bubble out of his head, but then the bubble just went through the enemies and froze them. It didn't kill them. But if I bounced the ball on my head, it got bigger with each bounce, and then if I pressed the B button, the ball turned into a falling projectile to kill all my enemies. And depending on the number of bounces, there's a different attack. 1 bounce and then attack creates a single projectile. 2 bounces makes 2 projectiles, so on and so forth to 5 bounces, and that makes a massive attack. It's kind of like a Metroid or a Mega Man charge beam and the risk-reward of using time and making yourself vulnerable to charge up the attack. It's also kind of a weirdly delayed attack because there's multiple seconds from when you start the bounce to when you pop the bubble to when the projectile rains down on the enemy. And in that time, the enemy could have moved out of the way or into it, which frankly is still really weird and unique for an action game. The game also has mild physics, so the bubbles can bounce off in different directions, and Spanky has to make sure he bounces it before it falls to the ground. Many levels are endless loops, like a Pac-Man game, so enemies may climb up to the ceiling and then appear at the bottom of the screen. And after playing the Game Boy game for 30 years, playing the Super Nintendo game on Switch is wild. It's giving answers to questions I never knew I had. Like, first off, there's a story. In Spanky's Quest Super Nintendo, Spanky actually has a quest. Go figure. And some shadowy witch does something and makes a bunch of evil sentient fruits and vegetables. I never knew this from the game. And I never once questioned why all the enemies and fruits were vegetables, because it was the 90s, video games were weird, sometimes your first word boss is a giant pineapple. I didn't even once think that there was an in-canon reason for this. And in the Game Boy game, when you pop the bubbles, little balls fall out. And I assume they were fireballs, rocks, a projectile. But what the Super Nintendo game shows me is that there's different attacks were actually sports balls, baseballs, volleyballs, basketballs. Now, why a monkey creates a bouncing bubble that turns into basketballs, I still don't know that. Don't know. And there's also some mild control changes that affect the gameplay, especially if you're used to one version, because the buttons are flipped between the 2 versions. In the Game Boy game, B is bubble, A is jump. The Super Nintendo game, B is jump, A is bubble. And also in the Game Boy game, Spanky has to touch the bubble to pop it. In the Super Nintendo game, you can just pop it from wherever. And this makes the Super Nintendo game, a little easier because you can foobar a bubble bounce and still pop it. Replaying the Game Boy game now, I can see why I liked it so much and why it made such an impression. 1, it's a really solid, unique platformer. 2, it's got a ton of levels with a lot of variety. And 3, and here's the real big kicker, it's really forgiving, so a child can muscle through it. Because if you lose all your lives, you just have to restart that stage. You're not bounced to the beginning of the world, but in the Super Nintendo game you are. And passwords are only 4 numerical digits long, so they're easy to remember. So I could easily beat it over a summer at daycare. So, if you played Super Nintendo Spanky's Quest on the Switch and you thought there was a germ of a good idea here, I actually recommend checking out the Game Boy version. I really do. Because its mechanics are a little tighter, its levels are a little more focused, and it's just a little simpler. Which in this case is good. Thank you for watching That Was a Game, and we'll see you again next time.